Good afternoon, everyone. And as you were told previously, my name is Ms. Joy Smith, and I am one of the faculty liaison librarians. Today, we'll be looking at formatting the manuscript-based theses, and basically, it's a demonstration of the template. Just to note, and you should note that the template isn't quite ready yet, but I have a sample of it that you can see, and perhaps within a month or so, we will have the template up on the website where you can also download it for use when you are ready with your writing. I do not mind being interrupted. Sometimes I think that's the best way to deal with the issue as it arises. So you can raise your hands and you can speak with me. Okay, we're going to look at the sections of the manuscript-based thesis, and we're going to pay attention to some of the formatting by section. We cannot do all because it's just a demo. And of course, I will be pointing out some useful tips. Two guides are provided for the manuscript-based thesis. We have the thesis guide, and this is a version that you should be using. The cover should have blue on it, and it's available from the library's website. It's also available from the postgraduate website under their documents library. The second document are revised guidelines that we received in 2021 for the manuscript-based theses. Now, these guidelines should be used in place of the ones in the thesis guide, but sometimes I prefer to use them together because I find it's better for clarity. This is also available from the Documents Library on the postgraduate website. And this is just a graphic showing you where you can get it. The thesis guide is available when you click on the Documents Library, and you can also get the guidelines for manuscript-based theses. Some things that you should note before you undertake this thesis: when you are preparing your manuscript, you are advised not to use another student's thesis as a model. And as a model, I mean for formatting and referencing, because sometimes the students would have been using one of the previous guides, whether the thesis guide or the style guide. So never do that. You can use the thesis of a student for content, not for formatting. If you're unsure of what is required, the two documents that I pointed out before should be used, and you can also contact your liaison librarian. Something of note as well is there are times when the style manual would have a rule, but there is a counter rule in the thesis guide. The thesis guide takes precedence. Okay, so if that happens, just remember, always check your thesis guide to see what is advised for that particular formatting guideline. Now, I'm assuming that everyone is here and knows what a manuscript-based thesis is, because I would think that you're interested in doing one for your exam. So a manuscript-based thesis consists of a collection of papers integrated into a cohesive unit, forming a single program of research. These manuscripts have been published or have been accepted for publication, and just now you would see how many of them should be published and how many of them will be accepted in the manuscript as being with the editor still or somewhere along the line, but it must have been accepted. Preliminary pages and formatting guides are the same for the traditional thesis as for the manuscript base. So you still have to use the thesis guide in order to see the formatting guidelines for the thesis. Now, you do not have to do a manuscript-based thesis. It is up to you. You can choose whether you want to do the traditional thesis, which is you write your chapters as usual, or you can choose to do the manuscript-based, where you intend to publish or you have published material. This option is available to MPhils, PhDs, and DBA programs only. And something to note, once the manuscript has been used in a thesis, no other co-author can use it in subsequent theses when they choose to write their own. The student must be the first or main lead author of the manuscript. So I have seen some where the student is the second author. I don't know what happened there, but you really should be the first or main author. And this is just a summary of what is required for an MPhil student. You have to have at least two manuscripts. One can be published and one accepted, or both of them can be published. For a PhD candidate, you can have a minimum of 3 manuscripts, either all published or 2 published and 1 accepted for publication. These are just some notes I extracted from the document, so you can go through them when you get the slides to note what you need to do. All right, so let's stop share here. Right, I will show you where the manuscript-based thesis template will be housed. It's not there currently. And after I show you where it will be housed, then I will show you a sample of what it will look like. For this, we go to the Alma Jordan Library's website. Just let me know if you are seeing my screen. Am I on a Google Browse screen right now?
Yes,
Are you
yes,
seeing
we're
that?
seeing it.
Okay,
Yes.
good. So I'm going to the Alma Jordan Library, and I am going to services for undergraduate, postgrad faculty. You would click on your category, which is postgrads. And under theses, this is where the templates are being housed with supporting documents. This one, thesis formatting tips, helps you when you have to format certain pages and do certain requirements stipulated in the thesis guide, such as landscape pages. The numbering has to change. Now, we are aware that some of the guidelines were more suited for a printed document or a printed version of the thesis, and those have not been changed in keeping with the new submission requirement of your document being in an electronic format. But bear with us, it will come. I know the margins are a pain, but for now, this is what we have and this is what we have to work with. So these are some guidelines for formatting the paper in Word. We do not have guidelines for LaTeX or LIX, as some of you may be using. That is up to you to learn that software program for yourself. But what we have here is just for Microsoft Word. So these are the formatting tips that you can use when you have to do certain things in your thesis. For now, the guidelines, these are for the traditional thesis, but we will update it to include additional guidelines for the manuscript-based thesis. Okay, so this is just where you will find it when we eventually put it up, but it's not there as yet. So I'm going to switch now to a demo of what it will look like. Okay, the first page of it deals with guidelines. You are not going to get away from reading guidelines because we have a template. You still need to read your guidelines, read the thesis guide, and read the guidelines provided by graduate studies, right? You still need to do that. And you need to also throw in your style manual because they all come to play when you are writing your thesis. So these are some guidelines. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just going to show some things For this one, you have to use the thesis guide and the guidelines for manuscript-based thesis. That is important. We do have some fields that are fillable. We couldn't do it for the whole thesis because that would be too limiting to you when you have to put in your data. Okay, so it's there for some fields, but not for all fields. There are also some guidelines on what to do, like if field codes show up, because of course we use codes to create the template. So this tells you what to do to get rid of them. And also for certain things like the table of contents, we would have used a table to create it. So there are guidelines there as well, telling you how to insert a new line, how to delete a line, and so on. Now, this template was done using the Chicago Manual of Style, and any other style would have to be done by the Liaison Librarian. So this one is mainly for Chicago. There's a note on authorship, and we spoke about it just now when we were on the slides, stating that you have to be the main or the primary author and that the manuscript can only be used once, and the co-authors cannot use it if the main author has already used it. And of course, the guidelines for how many manuscripts can be used by MPhil candidates and PhD candidates. This is here now, but I am thinking to take it out for numbered headings. I do not believe any candidate pursuing a manuscript-based thesis should do unnumbered headings. That is chaos. So you should be using numbered headings and subheadings. By that I mean you have your chapter 1, and then your subheadings would follow 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and so on. Failing that, you have to learn how to adjust your headings so that your reader know this is a second level heading, a third level heading, a fourth level heading. And that's why I do not recommend unnumbered headings for manuscript-based theses. You should number them. So these are guidelines that you will read before you proceed. And notice there's a note saying delete this page before you submit, because the guidelines are just for your benefit while doing the thesis, but you delete them when you're ready to submit. This is an example of the title page. The spacing has been done already for you, and these are fillable fields. So you click on the field and you would type your degree, if it's an MPhil or if it's a PhD, and you would say in what area. Okay, so these are fillable fields. This one we couldn't make it fillable because, of course, there's a limit to how many characters you can have in a fillable field. We had to leave it open. But just take note, this is not just words that you're seeing here. These are instructions. So type the title of your thesis here as approved by the Board of Graduate Studies and Research. Should be in bold, capital letters, single space, and centered at the top of the page. This follows, you click and you enter. And these are also clickable fields. It's for your name and the year of submission. Please note that the year of submission changes when you've been awarded your degree. Okay, so when you finally submit and the library says yes, the formatting is acceptable, you change the year of submission to the year when the degree has been conferred on you. Department, faculty information, these are also clickable fields. Post-exam, you will put in your declaration form. It's not placed before. Once it's pre-exam, you do not need to put it in, but it's put in post-exam. For the abstract, again, we have formatted the heading. You put your title here. Pay attention to rules for punctuation, for capitalization, for line spacing. These words here are instructions. We've repeated it so that we can get 300 words. There is a limit to how many words can be inserted in an abstract. Keywords, again, they have been formatted. You can have a keyword or a key phrase. They're each separated from each other by semicolons, and the list ends in a full stop. There's no need to bold the word keywords. So those are some things we see, and we have decided to create a template in order to forego that. Same thing, acknowledgements. Do not change the line spacing. What we've set up is the correct thing. It's supposed to be single line spacing. Dedication, all these are, they're not mandatory. You can choose whether you want to have one or you don't want to have one. Table of contents is not optional though. Now, this is what the table of contents should look like when you are doing it. There are some of you who know, you're very familiar with Microsoft Word, and you use the generator to create the table of contents, which means you have to be using the various headings. When you are using the headings, do not change the font size or type. So it should not be 14 or 16. All the font for your thesis, it's 12 or 11. That's what we recommended. And it's not 12 and 11, it's 12 or 11. Also, you have to avoid your headings, whether they're for the chapter or the subsections, running into the page number column. That's why we prefer to use a table, so we keep everything clean and in a column, so it doesn't run over into the next side. The preliminary pages, which is what we are going through right now, have an ordering. Page 8 of the thesis guide tells you which order they should be placed in. So don't put list of tables before list of figures. They are in sequential ordering as they should be. For the capitalization here, we recommend using title case or what we call headline case, because when you use all caps for major titles, these are all right, but when you come to chapter titles, they tend to get, it's a bit unsightly. So in your chapters, you can keep the all caps because you need it there, but in the table of contents, you can use headline keys. Again, instructions. This table was done using a table with no borders. So right now, you're only seeing these lines because I have grid lines on. If I take off my grid lines, you won't see anything. You will just see the words with no lines running in between. Okay, so that you're only seeing it because I have grid lines. A preface is required for a manuscript-based thesis, and we will see shortly what should go into it. You start your chapter information, and to note, you need to indent the different levels of your headings. Only 3 levels are required in the table of contents. In your chapters, you may have more, up to 4 and 5, but in the table of contents, you're only including 3 levels, and this is how they are indented. These are instructions for indenting it if you choose to use a table as we have done. At the end of every chapter, you should have a reference entry, right, as a subheading, but not numbered. So this cannot be 1.9 references. It's unnumbered. You can choose if you want to bold main headings. That is okay, but don't bold chapter 1 and leave introduction in normal Roman font. That won't work. If you're bolding, you are bolding. Okay, so I have a question on if references repeat between chapters, should the reference be repeated in the following chapter? You put the references at the end of the chapters in which they've been cited. So yes, if you cite Smith in chapter 1 and you cite Smith in chapter 2, you have to cite it. You have to include it in the reference list for chapter 2 as well. Now, when I go to the chapters, I will explain what's going on here, right? So you put all your headings in, make sure you have references at the end of each chapter. And then for your overall list of headings, I will advise that you use all caps because this one is a major one. If you are using a numbered style, forgo this one. Don't put the major one, because the problem is which one is number 1 and which one is number 2. Number 1 for chapter 1 and number 1 for chapter 3 may not be the same thing. So you are advised to put it at the end of each chapter, because I think that's a better place where your reader or your examiner can see that this reference was used in this chapter. Okay, so if you're a numbered style, do not use the overall list of references, just include the references at the end of each chapter. Then your appendices are placed here, and put a title to each appendix so your reader knows what is contained in there. All these are tables. If you do not need them, you just delete the pages. Something to note about figures. If you have figures in your appendices, they need to be numbered and lettered according to the appendix they fall in, and they should be placed in your list of figures. So figure C.1 is in appendix C, okay, and you number them like that. For chemistry, I know the numbering of figures is usually sequential, but here, for Chicago, it's double numeration. You can also do sequential in Chicago. I will advise don't do it. It's always best when your reader can look at your figure and know which chapter it's in. I prefer the double numeration, and yes, I have biases. So use the double numeration. I have seen chemistry students doing this, but it's not recommended for your style, so just remember that. The same rule applies for list of tables, and the instructions are in there. I'm not going to go into every instruction. You have to read it when you get it. Make sure that you do not put text citations in your captions for figures or tables. They should not be there. Chemistry students, I know you tend to put the superscript numbers attached to the last word or one of the words in the caption. No, you actually need a full citation, and you should not use superscript numbers when you are dealing with tables and figures, if they are borrowed, that is. Right, so everything else remains the same. The preface now, you will put the scope of your work here above, and then you need to include a section, contributions of authors. Note these words are plural. And here is where you will state your role in the work for each manuscript, and you also have to state it for the co-authors. You have to say what they've done. After the preface, that's
1 second.
sorry.
Sorry, there's a question here before you move on. Are the table of contents content hyperlinked? Right? Is it impossible? Is it impossible automatically create a TOC that meets the tabular criteria?
You have to do it manually. Right. Yeah. So after Word generates it, you would have to go and if you have titles or subheadings that go into the page number column, you have to break it before. So you'd have to put in some space so that it goes over to the next line, and you would have to format it. So I know people do this one because it's hyperlinked. It's easy to, when you go into view, you can use the navigation pane and jump to sections, which is very useful when I'm checking theses. But if you use that feature in Word, then you have to do the formatting yourself.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So the preface ends that first section of the thesis, which we refer to as preliminary pages, okay? Just remember, we've listed all that the thesis guide recommends, but you do not need to use all. If you don't have one or two of them, like table cases and statutes and dedication, that's fine. Note in the thesis guide, they would say, if any. If you don't see that, that means you need to have one. Now, some people think that for the preface, you don't need one. You do need a preface because that's where you have to put in your contributions of authors. And now we start the chapters. Chapter 1, now in the traditional thesis, these are fillable fields, but not for manuscript-based. Your chapter 1 is your introduction. Some people say introduction, some people say general introduction, and I'm quoting the guidelines for manuscript-based theses here. This chapter places the research in the appropriate literature context, and that's where you put the rationale and objectives for the research, so your chapter 1 is needed. Here we have guidelines as to how to enter text. So we recommend indenting the first line of each new paragraph. There's a feature in Word that allows you to do that. There are instructions for including your subheadings, how you number them, and how you align them, whether they're left or centered, if they're bold. The font size and type is also enumerated here, so you can read it. If you need to include quotations, there are instructions on how to do that as well. Okay, so what we usually recommend is that you replicate the chapters, but for this one, you don't have to. I would say do it from chapter 4. Chapters 1 and 2 are set. You must have those in a manuscript-based thesis. From chapter 3, you start your first manuscript chapter. So these two, don't replicate them, but chapter 4, you can replicate it to get your other chapters. So we just have instructions as to how to enter your text. And as I said, you need to read them. This is an example of a 3rd level heading. This is an example of a 4th level heading. And these are instructions for including figures. Now, again, bold the whole heading if you must. Don't just bold figure 1.1. Bold the whole thing. There are instructions here for line spacing for titles that comprise more than one line. There are instructions for including your labels. And these, if it's one word, it's lowercase. If it's 2 words, you switch to sentence case. So pay attention. All these things matter when you're formatting. And you know, sometimes you get a nitpicky examiner. And if the formatting is off, it's like they can't focus on the content. So you don't want your formatting to give you a disadvantage when you have to have your work examined. All right, and there are rules for different types of figures. So you will go through those in your own time. If you have a multi-part figure, there are rules for how you break it and how you insert it. Now, all this is in the traditional as well, but you have added features. If you have a landscape page, we have the formatting tips that tells you how to do that. I'm going to go to the end of the chapter because that's where manuscript picks up again. At the end of the chapter, a list of references must be provided. The heading for the references should be formatted as an unnumbered subheading. Do not number it. And you include your references right at the end of the chapter. You do not need to start on a new page if there is space after your conclusion. So that's at the end of chapter 1, which is your general introduction, sorry. Your chapter 2 is your lit review. And at the end of this chapter, again, you must have your references. We did not put back all the text that we had before, but certainly when we do the template, we will put it back in case you need an example of a table or a figure or so on. So at the end of literature review, you need references again. And if you notice, we have formatted the references for you. If you just look, you can see what material type it is. So this is a book. This is an electronic book. We have journals, printed, electronic journals, conference proceedings. You will look at it and figure out which one you need to have. And these are examples of what they should look like, even when we have corporate authors. When we get to chapter 3, this is your first manuscript or your first chapter that was published. You should include your name and your affiliation. It's always good to do that. And if you have co-authors, same thing, co-author affiliation. You need a note about the status of the chapter. This chapter was published. and you would include a reference citation for it. If it's in press, then you put a note, this chapter is forthcoming, and you would put as much of the reference citation as you know, because you may not know everything like issue numbers and so on, but you can put in as much of it as you have knowledge of. And if the chapter has been accepted, well, same thing you would do. You can say this chapter was accepted by transactions of the Thesis Society. Of course, we're making it up. After you have your display page, this is what it's called, a display page that consists of the chapter, your title for the chapter, your name, status of the publication. You then go into the abstract. When you enter the abstract, we do not know if this one also has a word limit. So we don't really check here, but you do need to put in your keywords just as you did in the first one. After that, your introduction follows, and do not push the introduction down to the next page. It starts right there. It's the continuation of the chapter. In your conclusion, you need to put a connecting statement that tells us how this chapter is related to the next one coming, because in a manuscript thesis, you have to create cohesion. Remember, you are putting in different manuscripts that were published, and we need to see the relationship between them. So your connecting text goes in the conclusion. It is not a subheading, so don't put connecting text or connecting statement. It should just be a note that tells the reader what you summarized and what you intend to cover in the next chapter. So I just have an example here based on the same manuscript-based thesis. This chapter outlines the elements required in preparing manuscript-based theses. The display page is a required element of a manuscript-based thesis as it introduces the following chapter and provides notes about the authors. Chapter 4 will highlight the elements of each manuscript chapter. I know my time is up. Right,
Yes.
and at the end of that, you put your references. And just one more chapter we will include in this template, which is the next chapter, only to show you. We have the display page again, and then same thing, abstract introduction. And in the introduction, we put another statement connecting this chapter with the previous one. Okay, so place connecting statement in last paragraph of chapter and introduction to the next chapter. So make a statement. This chapter outlines the elements which we'll discuss. Of course, I have my chapter number wrong, so it should be 3. So that is how you would go about doing and connecting the manuscript-based thesis. After that, your references follow, and you go until you put in your last chapter, and then you would have your overall list of references. We have more guidelines for these here, which you can read in your own time. And this one is the full thing. So it's a major heading. It starts with the words in all caps and bolded and centered.
Joy, I have a couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're out of time, and the next session starts promptly at 1:30. So
Right.
can you repeat where this template can be found?
So as it's still being worked on, okay? We have to include the guidelines in that Excel spreadsheet. So I would say, I said a month, but let's say a month to 2 months before we have it up and ready. It will be on the library's website. When it's ready, we will send out notice to the faculties. The liaison librarians would let you know that the thesis is available, the manuscript-based thesis, and you can access it from the library's website.
Okay, and another question. I missed, do we insert published manuscripts? Oops, just now, published manuscripts as is, or do we insert only the content of the manuscript?
You are inserting the manuscript, but you have to change it to meet the rules for the thesis guide and Chicago Manual of Style, because sometimes when you submit a journal, they would use another style manual. It may not be Chicago author date. And sometimes they do use Chicago author date, but journals reserve the right to change some of the formatting rules as they see fit. So I know some lecturers tell you to use a journal article and follow their formatting. That is incorrect. You have to use the thesis guide and you have to be guided by your style manual. If you're not certain, you can always write to your liaison librarian.
Okay. I missed the first part of this presentation. Is there a link to access this thesis
Right,
guide?
so that was answered already.
So that was answered as well. And the last question, not sure if this was mentioned, but does the manuscript-based thesis have a word limit similar to the traditional thesis?
I have not seen a word limit for it, but you can reach out to Graduate Studies and find out. Because I did not see that in the document.
No.
Yeah.
As well as your supervisors. So, yes. So I think that we're out of time because persons have just about 8 minutes to get into the breakout sessions for the specific reference and styles. So,
Okay, so thank you for coming. And this guide, as I said, would be out, let's say 2 months and not say 1 month and then you look out. So about 2 months, we should have it ready. Of course, if you know what you need to put in on your display page and your references at the end of the chapters, you can use the traditional template and just insert them in. But we will try to have it ready in about 2 months.
And remember that the references here, this template is for Chicago, right?
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, Joy?
They are for Chicago.
But the other styles will be coming on stream as well.
You can contact me or you can contact your liaison librarian. Which faculty are you in, Renoir? Oh, well, I am your librarian. So you can write me. You can always email me.
So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I hope you found it very useful. And thank you, Ms. Smith. So please, you have just a few minutes to join your next session.